We have Yasmine Hernandez, and I'm so excited that she's going to be participating in Fusion New York. I
I'm
can't even begin to
excited
tell you. And she's going to be doing a premiering work, The Outlaw Clothesline. And I want her to tell you a little bit about the story behind that premiering work. So why don't you tell us a little bit?
The Outlaw Clothesline is an idea that came to me in tribute to my brother shortly after we unfortunately lost him to cancer. We grew up in Brooklyn. At the time that this artwork is focused on, you're talking about the late 70s, early 80s, we were in Park Slope, Brooklyn. And it was a very different time than what we know today. And there was this subculture that emerged among youth of color that my brother was driven to, and it was the style of dressing, the style of being that they refer to themselves as the outlaws, okay? And so it wasn't necessarily that he was connected to any particular group or any particular gang. It was more embodying this form of dress, this style of dress. So it was merging this urban aesthetic with the rising hip hop of the time with this more like, Harley. Back then we had the biker gangs, but I'm talking about the dookie, like Harley Davidson. So the MC boots, the MC jackets, wearing raccoon tails on leather caps, the leather, the chains. That was part of the aesthetic. And my brother was a young teen and he dressed this way, and this is when he was developing his graffiti style and was out bombing trains and all of that, driving my mother crazy. I was a little girl and I observed this as him being this essence of the rebel, protective big brother.
Okay.
And so the Outlaw Clothesline takes the bandanas that were so prevalent to me in this aesthetic that he created for himself, and it's using those as the canvas for this work. Instead of the rope that my mom would hang as the clothesline to dry out clothes, I'm using the chain that he will wear hanging out his pocket to hang all these bandanas, which are these sort of holy shrouds, I call them, where I bring my brother's image back to life and part of his narrative back to life. It marks a very nostalgic, beautiful time where he was young enough to know that there was something to rebel against, but still too young to really understand how evil things can be out there. And I realized that that's the angle I'm coming at it from, as this 5-year-old mind that I'm sort of going back to, observing this through those innocent eyes. So I know I kind of took it through all these circles, but that it's a very personal project that I have to dig in here for to let out and to even speak about.
Wow, that's powerful. And one of the things that impressed me about this premiering work was, this past summer there was that unfortunate incident on the West Side Highway where the family was kind of attacked by a motorcycle group. And yes, that's tragic. I'm not condoning the action, but what caught my attention was the fact that what they were really trying to do was kind of add a layer to their lives in this persona that they were trying to build. And it was about also being on the motorcycles, the helmet, the speed, and all of that. And it touched me in the sense that people sometimes need more in their everyday lives than what's presented. They got to craft it out. And that's what caught me, because it sounded like your brother was trying to do that in a very creative way. It was with dress, it was with poetry, it was with their bravado, the way they walk the street, their attitude. And I feel that that's something that we should pay attention to. How do we, as we're dealing with the show and dealing with the theme of how do we live as full human beings, how do we go about doing that? And it allows us to question that and wonder and don't judge, because I think that's the most important thing, to not judge. And so I'm very glad that you're doing this, and maybe I'm wrong, but that's what it seemed like your brother was trying to do, expand the depths of his everyday life.
I think one of the things that I consider for this project beyond my brother is masculinity, and specifically masculinity as it pertains to men of color, because of the way that men of color have been packaged and commodified by the media. And there's this persona that is profitable, basically. And then there is the reality of what that represents for the individual. There is the reality that comes from humanity, the inevitable vulnerability that must be there, that it's like society says you can be this way but won't give you a pass for the vulnerable aspect. And then when news occurs, you know, men of color could do these amazing deeds, and we seldom see that on the news, but men of color get together and there's this incident that unfolds, and all of a sudden that's all over the different news channels. Definitely, I think that my brother had a sense that there was more to rebel against. My brother talked to me the first time he ever heard me speak publicly. I did a lecture at NYU, and he wrote me this email where he responds to having seen that, because I was his baby sister. And he talked about in the 70s he saw a documentary on PBS about the Vietnam War, and that was something that he felt politicized him. It was the first time that he got a glimpse into what oppression could be, injustice could be. And all over our block we would see a lot of addicts strung out coming back from Vietnam, and the thing back then before crack was heroin, you know? So that my brother was awakening to these things. And even later in his life, he became this hero. My brother was known, he was the person you would call if you were out in the street trying to cop, but you were in recovery. So he then shifted all of that and became this community hero, and never negated that other part of himself. If anything, those were layers that got him to be the hero that he came to be. You talked about not judging, and my brother, one of the things I admire about him and that I strive so hard, because it's hard to do, it's a thing of grace to have, where I believe that if my brother talked to the president, or talked to a homeless man, or talked to his boss, or talked to his mom, he would treat everybody with the same level of respect. And I always thought that that was a very beautiful thing, and I think that that's a sensibility you could only get to having the sensitivity and the understanding of life on the street, and then life everywhere else.
But what you just said to me was that having that consciousness, you know, having it awoken, helped him to go beyond, you know, every day. And that's what helped him to treat everybody the same. That's really important, because the purpose of the show is to be inclusive of many voices. And I find that, and please tell me, you know, I find that the art world isn't as inclusive of everybody's voices. I don't know what they're afraid about. What do you think they're afraid about?
I think people want to tell our stories for us. And people like to make assumptions of who other people are, and they're afraid of having those assumptions debunked. You know, it's like everyone develops their own truth. And if you challenge that truth, people get very defensive. And
very
I think
narcissistic.
that too. So I think that we are a threat when we rise to tell our own stories in our own truth and in our own voice. It's very common to, you know, like I said, this is a commodity. Our stories, our lives are a commodity when other people get to talk about us, poke fun at us, you know, criticize, pick and pull. When a person of color rises to do that in themselves in a dignified light, now all of a sudden that's subversive and that's a threat. So that's something that I've always been very mindful of. I think that the difference here is that art in privileged spaces has always been about entertaining the haves, right, at the expense of the have-nots. That's something I learned as a student. All those ballerinas that they got painted, a lot of them were poor women. A lot of them, unfortunately, had to double in prostitution because they were making ends meet. Today, we look at that as this form of high art, the ballet. Back then, they were the poor of society. One of the things that allowed my brother this consciousness was the access to art and the access to music.
All right, so I just want to say thank you. This was really, really good. I had so much fun engaging with you. And I think we're going to really take Armory Week by storm this year, don't you?
I am very excited of what's going to come out of this. I am very grateful that you invited me, and I am enthusiastically awaiting what's going to come out of this exhibit. Thank you.
Thank you.